Today, we're diving straight into the history behind one of America's absolute most complex, fascinating, and frankly, heavily debated icons, Malcolm X. Now, for decades, he's been this frozen symbol, right? A symbol of uncompromising action and fiery rhetoric. But the real story of his life? It's actually a brilliant, deeply layered series of reinventions. So historian Manning Marable spent over a decade digging through archives and interviewing people who were actually there, all to ask one massive question: how much of the legend isn't true, and how much just hasn't been told? To separate the actual man from the myth, we really have to look past the famous autobiography we all think we know. And to understand how this legend was built in the first place, we actually need to start our story near the very end. Picture this. It's Sunday afternoon, February 21, 1965. We're at the Audubon Ballroom in Upper Manhattan. Malcolm is scheduled to speak for his brand new political group, the Organization of Afro-American Unity. At 1:45 p.m., his security team spots a known loyalist of the Nation of Islam, a group Malcolm had very publicly and dangerously broken away from. This guy is sitting brazenly right in the front row. By 2:30, the crowd swells to over 200 people. And then, right around 3 p.m., a stage disturbance breaks out in the back. As his security rushes to intervene, they leave Malcolm entirely alone on the stage. And that's when an assassin steps forward with a sawed-off shotgun. The sheer vulnerability of that moment was the direct result of some glaring, almost unbelievable security failures. You see, despite his home being firebombed literally just a week prior, Malcolm insisted his security detail remain unarmed. Only his bodyguard carried a weapon. But what's truly shocking here is the complete absence of the NYPD. Normally, you'd have up to 24 officers stationed there with a clear, direct view of the ballroom. On this specific day, not a single officer was at the main entrance. And attendees walking in wearing bulky winter coats, they were never even searched for weapons. The intricate details of that tragic afternoon and the wildly complicated life that led up to it are masterfully decoded in the primary source we're using for this explainer. It's Manning Marble's Pulitzer Prize-winning research, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. Marble's exhaustive work totally bypasses the pop culture legend to uncover the heavy systemic forces and deep personal tragedies that actually molded Malcolm. Now, you might be thinking, don't we already know his story from the autobiography of Malcolm X? Well, that book was co-authored by Alex Haley. And it turns out there was a massive curiosity gap between the two men. They had totally different agendas. Malcolm was using the book to explain his evolving politics and his recent break from black separatism. Haley, on the other hand, was a liberal Republican who viewed the whole project as a cautionary tale about the human waste produced by racial segregation. And because Malcolm was tragically assassinated before the book was published, Haley ultimately got the final say on the text. Because of that final edit, the autobiography just isn't the whole truth. Crucial, highly political chapters were straight up deleted prior to publication. This included details about his primary political organization, the OAU, and his broader vision for United Front. This selective editing basically created a permanently frozen image of him, totally obscuring a much more complicated, strategic, and global thinker. So to understand who he truly was, we really have to go back to his roots. And those roots, they are deeply, deeply embedded in Garveyism and Pan-Africanism. Malcolm's parents, Earl and Louise Little, actually met in Montreal and became fiercely dedicated organizers for Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. They truly believed in a transnational Black identity, economic self-sufficiency, and ultimate political independence for people of African descent. For the Littles, this wasn't just some casual political stance. It was their entire way of life, and unfortunately, it made them massive targets. Because of Earl's militant organizing, the family faced relentless, terrifying racial violence. We're talking about being chased across the Midwest by white supremacist groups. First, it was the Ku Klux Klan in Omaha, and later, a vigilante offshoot known as the Black Legion in Michigan. The Little family lived in a constant state of siege. The threat of extreme violence was just woven into the fabric of their daily reality. Which brings us to this truly chilling story that Malcolm remembered for the rest of his life. In the winter of 1925, a hooded Klansman rode right up to the Littles' home in Omaha in the dead of night. Earl was away preaching at the time, so Louise, who was actually pregnant with Malcolm right then, bravely stepped out onto the front porch completely alone to face down these armed night riders. Frustrated, the vigilantes shattered every single window in the house before, as Malcolm later described it, they rode off, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. Just incredible bravery. Seeking safety, the family eventually moved to Lansing, Michigan, but the terror just followed them. The Littles bought a farmhouse in a neighborhood that had racially restrictive covenants secretly written into the property deeds. When legal attempts to evict them stalled out, a white mob took matters into their own hands and literally burned the farmhouse to the ground while the family slept inside. And the wildest part? Instead of hunting down the mob, local police unjustly arrested Earl Little for arson, accusing him of burning his own home for the insurance money. This horrific violence culminated on September 8, 1931. Earl Little was found critically injured, his body crushed under a streetcar, way far away from where he was even supposed to be that evening. Now, the local coroner officially ruled it an accident. However, the Black community, and especially the Little family, firmly believed Earl was bludgeoned and thrown on those tracks by the Black Legion as a brutal, final punishment for his political organizing. As you can imagine, this tragedy completely shattered the family, sparking a rapid, systemic collapse. First, unpaid creditors swarmed what little life insurance payout there was. Then came the constant, heavy-handed interventions by state welfare workers, who eventually broke the family apart, reassigning the children, including young Malcolm, to foster care. The crushing weight of all this ultimately led to Louise's total breakdown. What Marable's research highlights so powerfully here is the psychological toll this took. The state pensions were woefully inadequate, basically keeping the family in a constant state of starvation. But honestly, even worse was the demeaning meddling by the welfare workers. They didn't just provide meager funds. They systematically broke down the proud, self-sufficient Garveyite identity the Littles had worked so hard to build, replacing it with the heavy stigma of being destitute wards of the state. The final blow came just days before Christmas in 1938, when Louise was found wandering barefoot in the freezing snow, clutching her newest baby. By January 1939, she was committed to the Kalamazoo State Hospital, where tragically she would remain for the next 24 years. For Malcolm, having to witness his brilliant, proud mother succumb to the sheer systemic pressures of poverty and institutionalization was a heartbreaking event that profoundly shaped how he viewed the world. The family anchor was just gone. Placed in a foster home, Malcolm attended a nearly all-white school in Mason, Michigan. And, get this, despite being a top student and even his class president, his white English teacher crushed his dream of becoming a lawyer, telling him to be realistic and take up carpentry instead. But in 1941, everything changed. A visit to his older half-sister, Ella, opened his eyes to a completely different universe, Boston. It was a city just bursting with vibrant Black culture and real economic opportunity. Malcolm eventually moved to Boston to live with Ella in a neighborhood known as The Hill. This was a fast-paced, transitional area home to a rising Black middle class, and it was here that Malcolm began observing some really stark class divides within the Black community itself. He noticed how the older, established Black bourgeois families kind of looked down on the newer Southern and Caribbean migrants. But ironically, it was those exact migrants who were bringing a fierce, aggressive entrepreneurial spirit to the city. Finding the strict middle-class life a bit stifling, Malcolm got a job as a shoe shine boy at the Roseland Ballroom, and he absolutely loved it. He soaked in the big band jazz, the wildly energetic Lindy Hop dancers, and the incredible glamour of Black celebrities like Duke Ellington and Count Basie. He injected his own manic energy into the hustle, famously boasting about making his shine rag sound like someone had set off Chinese firecrackers just to impress the musicians and score bigger tips. He was wide-eyed, taking in the whole shebang of the big city. And this right here is where his first major reinvention takes place. Guided by a street-smart musician named Shorty, Malcolm completely shed his country boy image. He started wearing flashy zoot suits, conking his hair, and diving headfirst into the underworld economy. He quickly learned the numbers racket, petty thievery, and street hustling. Malcolm Little from Lansing literally transformed himself into the worldly, dangerous character known on the streets as Detroit Red. Which leaves us with a final, really provocative thought to chew on. We all know he eventually becomes a global human rights leader, a minister, and a massive political visionary. So how does a teenager surviving on the gritty streets use those exact same survival skills, reading people, mastering rhetoric, entirely reinventing his identity, to later captivate the entire world? It just goes to show how much deeper and more complex the true story of Malcolm X really is. Thanks for hanging out for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history you think you know.